A few years ago, I decided to take a trip to California to visit some friends. I lived a few states away and planned to fly in, but I needed a place to stay while I was there. Initially, I looked at hotels, but they were difficult to find, so I decided to check out Airbnbs as well. Those were also hard to find. After a long time of searching, I finally found an Airbnb that seemed to be a really good deal. It was certainly cheaper than any hotels and seemed like it would work just fine for me. But from the start, the owner of the room seemed a little bit sketchy. The way the ad was written was a little bit odd. There were some spelling errors, and the pictures were sort of weird. The place also didn't have any reviews yet. So when I first saw it, I kept looking. But after not finding anything nearly as cheap, I considered it again. It was a very small house, and I would have the whole place to myself. The value just seemed way better than any other place that I had looked at. Everybody was most likely scared off by the less than ideal photos and description. After all, most of the listings you see on Airbnb look to be professionally photographed and well written. Plus, there were no reviews yet. So I decided to just go for it. Having a whole place to myself would be really nice, as opposed to just having a small room or staying in somebody's basement. I reserved the place and was slightly nervous about it, but more excited to go to California and visit my friends. When the time came, after my flight, I took a lift to the location. It was towards the end of a quieter street and seemed to have a decent-sized yard. I had instructions on where the key was, which was hidden in the backyard. After I got it, I went inside the house. It was pretty much just how it looked online, and I was feeling good about it. The place was very small, but good enough for me, and I was proud of myself for getting such a great deal. The house was one level and didn't have an upstairs or basement. There was just a kitchen, a living room, one bedroom, and a bathroom. I was in the house for a little bit and then left to meet up with my friends. I hung out with them for basically the rest of the night. Later that evening, I returned to my small Airbnb at probably about 10 p.m. When I got inside, I started to get ready for bed. I was really tired, and within maybe 10 minutes, I was about to get into the bed. I turned out all of the lights in the small house and was making my way over to the bedroom. That's when I saw what looked like somebody walking past the window in the backyard. It really took me by surprise, and I stopped walking and looked. But by that time, the person was now out of my view in the backyard. It was very dark. The only reason that I had seen the person at all was because I had turned all the lights inside off. I didn't get a good look at them, but it seemed to be a man. I walked over to the window and looked out but saw nobody. After that, I went over to a couple of other windows and looked out but also saw nothing. I decided to try to go to bed now, although I wasn't quite as tired anymore. When I got into the bedroom, though, I saw the man again. Once more, I didn't get a good look at him at all. He briefly moved past the window, which wasn't very big. Now I knew somebody was prowling around out there, and I was really concerned. I went back into the living room and looked out of that window. When I didn't see anything, I went all around to the other windows. There were no shades or blinds for the windows at all, which was too bad, because I wanted to cover them. The windows were not very big, but I just didn't want whoever was walking around to be able to get in or see inside. I made sure the door was locked and then stayed up for a little while. When I didn't see anything for like 30 minutes, I finally got tired again and went back to the bedroom. I got in bed and tried to just ignore the bad feeling that I had. I really wanted to get some sleep. Whoever was out there didn't try to get in or anything, so I was telling myself that I would be okay. I laid in bed for no more than 5 minutes before I started to feel very paranoid. I opened my eyes and looked up. When I did, I saw there was a man staring right in the window. This time I got a good look at his face. When he saw me, he ducked straight down after like a second. He looked really familiar to me, though for a few seconds I didn't know where I'd seen him. Then I remembered. I ran into the small hallway, which was the only area with no windows. I went on my phone and onto the Airbnb app. That's when I realized that the man in the window was the owner of the Airbnb. He had been staring into the window watching me try to sleep. I wanted to get out of there. I knew that he likely had keys. After all, he owned the place. I packed up all of my things right then and there and left. When I left the house, I ran for my car but didn't see or hear the guy. Then I drove to a random parking lot and tried to find a hotel for the night. I had to drive a ways away and also pay more than I wanted to. But I got lucky and was able to find a hotel room. I also reported the man to Airbnb. When I sent him a message about it, he completely denied everything. After that, I never used Airbnb again. I once booked an Airbnb by myself in Arizona because I had a job interview there. Since it was so far from home, I decided to make a short trip out of it. I chose this particular Airbnb because it was much cheaper than any hotel I could find. It was about half an hour away from the interview location, which was fine with me. The place was off a dead-end secluded road and had a nice view of the desert in the backyard. I brought my laptop with me to get work done for my current job during the day, which kept me busy most of the time. I planned to stay for 3 days. My interview was on the second day, which was a Tuesday, and I would be leaving on Friday. On Monday night, the night before my interview, I was practicing interview questions and getting some last-minute knowledge about the company. I was doing this on my laptop in the living room around 9 p.m. when I heard a tap at the window. It wasn't exactly a knock. It sounded more like someone tapping a finger on the glass. My head swung to the left to look at the window in reaction. I didn't see anyone, but it was pitch black outside. I was kind of scared to look out the window, but I had to be brave and just do it. There was no one there as far as I could see. Just darkness. Maybe it was a bug hitting the window. After all, Arizona has some pretty nasty bugs. The next day, I got through my interview and thought I did pretty well. For the rest of my trip, I explored different parts of the town in my car, ate at different restaurants, and relaxed in the backyard in the sun. Little did I know, someone was likely watching me while I was in the backyard. At night, I was inside watching Breaking Bad on Netflix when it happened again. A single tap at the window. This time, it was obvious it wasn't a bug. I was even more disturbed, but once again rushed to the window. Even though I saw no one, it didn't mean someone wasn't out there. I checked the windows by the front door, then opened the door and looked outside for a second. Seeing no one, I went back inside and then to the back door. I stepped outside onto the back porch and looked out to the desert behind the house. Silence and darkness. Then I heard a click, a sound like someone clicking their tongue at the roof of their mouth. It was off in the distance beyond the light from the house, somewhere in the cold desert. I felt as though someone could be hiding behind any number of bushes, watching me and toying with me. I yelled out, and almost in response there was another click. I pinpointed the direction it came from and looked that way. I could see someone now, standing not too far away, dressed in dark clothes blending into the darkness of the desert. I started walking closer but then stopped, realizing I didn't want to get any closer to that person. I called out, "You're on private property. I'm going to call the cops if you don't leave." The person quickly walked away. I theorized it might be the Airbnb owner, but that seemed far-fetched. I didn't know what to think. The next night I was in bed on my laptop watching Breaking Bad again before going to sleep. I think I watched 2 episodes, so I was doing this for about an hour and a half. I didn't hear any noises in the house, though I was definitely thinking about the encounter from earlier. When I finally turned off the light and tried to fall asleep, within 10 seconds, there was a click sound again, muffled, coming from inside the closet. I looked at the closet door, which was open just a crack. My natural response was to spring off the bed, still in my pajamas, and run to the car. I sat in the driveway with the car running and called 911. I stared at the house as I spoke to the dispatcher, waiting to see if someone would come out. All my stuff was still in there. A police car arrived, and together we did a quick investigation of the house. It was very small, with not many places to hide. There were no signs of forced entry. Conclusively, I packed my stuff and left that night for a nearby hotel. I contacted both Airbnb and the host, and was only able to get a partial refund for my stay. I still think it might have been the host of the Airbnb. Who else would have access to the house? There were no signs of forced entry, which leads me to believe whoever it was might have had a key. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it was a stranger who snuck in at an opportune time. A few years ago, I decided to rent out my basement on Airbnb to make some extra money. I own a 2-story house with a finished basement that I thought would be perfect for guests. The house had more space than I needed, and it was a bit of an investment, so this seemed like a good idea. I spent some time fixing up the basement, adding new carpet and furniture. The basement has a bedroom, a bathroom, and a large living room. I also added a small kitchen in the corner with a sink, stove, refrigerator, and a counter. Once everything was ready, I took some pictures and listed it on Airbnb. My house is only about 5 minutes away from a major city, so I figured people would want to stay in the area. Sure enough, I started getting guests. Since I set up a smart lock on the door leading to the basement, I didn't even notice when people were staying there. They would arrive after check-in time, and I would go down to clean after they checked out. I also restocked items like water bottles in the fridge. The basement received really good reviews, and I was happy about it. Most of the people who stayed there were really nice. Although I didn't meet many of them in person, the few that I did meet were great. One time, a guy rented my basement for a night. Everything seemed normal, just like with any other guest. The next day, after checkout time had passed, I went down to clean. Normally, cleaning wouldn't take too long since the place was never left in bad shape. Most guests left it as clean as it was before they checked in. I would disinfect the countertops and vacuum the carpet, and that was usually it. I usually went down to clean an hour or two after guests checked out, depending on if I had another guest coming that night. This time, I didn't have anyone staying the next night, so I went down a bit later, around 8 p.m. I started by cleaning the countertops, and everything seemed normal. Nothing was out of place. Next, I began vacuuming the carpet. All the floors in the basement were carpeted, except for a small area in the kitchen and bathroom. I started in the living room and soon moved into the bedroom. As I vacuumed under the bed, the vacuum hit something. Curious, I stopped and looked underneath. To my shock, I saw a man crawling out from under the bed. It was the same guy who had rented the room. I jumped back and asked him what he was doing there. Without saying a word, the guy ran past me, up the stairs and out the door. I quickly made sure he left and then tried to contact him through Airbnb, but I never got a response. I have no idea what he was doing hiding under my bed, and it still creeps me out to think about it. It was a really weird experience, and I'll never forget it. In the summer of 2015, my boyfriend Sean and I decided to take a trip to Vermont. We were excited to escape the hustle and bustle of our daily lives and enjoy some time in nature. I found a charming Airbnb listing for an off-grid cabin. It had hundreds of 5-star reviews, so I felt confident it would be a great place to stay. The cabin was an old one-room structure with a potbelly stove and a loft area for sleeping. There was no electricity, and it was located in a remote part of Vermont, down an old dirt road. The nearest house, owned by our host, was about half a mile away, but she was out of town, so we had the place to ourselves. We arrived around 4 p.m. and spent a lovely evening cooking dinner and playing board games by candlelight. We had hiked all day, so by 10 p.m. we were exhausted. I went up to the loft to sleep while Sean decided to sit outside and smoke. About 20 minutes later, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I was jolted awake by a loud banging sound on the side of the cabin. Before I could call out, Sean shouted up to me, asking if it was me making the noise. I groggily replied, "No, was that you?" He said no, but didn't seem too worried since he was sitting outside and hadn't seen anyone. We camp often, so we're used to strange noises at night. We figured it was probably a tree branch falling against the cabin and tried to go back to sleep. But just as I started to drift off again, there was another loud bang, this time from a different part of the cabin. I jumped out of bed and climbed down from the loft, meeting Sean as he came through the door. He told me to grab anything sharp I could find and go back into the loft. Although he was trying to stay calm, I could tell he was a little freaked out. I asked him what he thought it was, but he cautiously said he didn't know. He mentioned that he might have heard footsteps while he was outside. As we whispered about what to do, we heard a slow, scraping noise trailing along the wall of the cabin. Then, silence again. I was really scared and didn't know what to do. Our car was parked about 100 feet away, but we'd have to face whatever was out there in the dark to get to it. I was also worried that if it was a person, they might have tampered with the car. Sean told me to stay very quiet and go back up to the loft while he waited downstairs. He had a hunting knife and a large stick, while I had a few steak knives. We were basically sitting ducks. The cabin had large windows on 3 walls, half of which were just screens. So if someone was outside, they could easily see us or get inside. I wanted to stay downstairs, but Sean insisted I go upstairs, saying it would be easier for him to handle things without worrying about me. I reluctantly went up and sat in the middle of the bed, clutching the knives. I listened intently, my heart pounding in my chest. Sean shouted out, "Hello?" to see if he could get a response or scare off any animals. There was nothing for what felt like 20 minutes. Then the scraping sound returned, louder this time, like someone dragging a rake across the side of the cabin. I heard clear, methodical footsteps moving around the cabin. Sean came up to the loft and pulled the ladder up. He didn't like that they could see him, but he couldn't see them. If someone came in, at least we could get the jump on them from up here. We sat on the bed in silence, staring at each other in terror. It was around midnight, and I realized we were going to be stuck in that cabin until morning. The noises continued and intensified. There were more bangs from different sides of the cabin, and the scraping kept coming back. This couldn't have been an animal. The sounds were too deliberate. We didn't hear any grunting like from a bear or bobcat, just the constant crunch of footsteps. There were pauses of 10 to 20 minutes, then the noises would start up again. At one point we heard a rattling sound like someone was trying to climb the pipe that fed into the potbelly stove. This went on for hours. Sean and I lay there paralyzed with fear, staring at each other. I kept expecting the front door to burst open, or the screen window to tear. I was convinced we were about to be murdered. Every gruesome possibility played in my head, but no one ever came inside. We never heard voices, whispers, or deranged giggling, just the loud scraping, banging, rattling, and footsteps. Finally, around 5 a.m., we heard roosters in the distance, and the loft was slowly lit by the early dawn light. The sound stopped. I managed to get about 2 hours of sleep, because we had to drive to Pennsylvania later that day. Thankfully, our car was fine, and we packed up as quickly as possible to get out of there. Sean looked around the cabin, trying to find scraping marks or clear footprints, but there was nothing. I messaged the Airbnb host to tell her about our experience, and she said it must have been a porcupine. If you find a porcupine that makes loud banging noises and walks like a human, let me know. To this day, Sean and I debate what it could have been. He thinks it was a crazy local trying to scare us away. Either way, I'm just glad we weren't murdered that night. In October of 2019, I traveled from New Jersey to Los Angeles to compete in a table tennis tournament. I often traveled around the country for these events, usually staying with teams also competing to save money. However, this time, I had to stay alone. I hastily booked an Airbnb near the Vegas Strip without realizing that the neighborhood wasn't the best. I thought about canceling and finding another place, but I convinced myself that it was convenient, and I wouldn't be spending much time there anyway. When I arrived, I didn't see the host, and I wouldn't have known who to look for since the profile picture on Airbnb was just a flower. The host had given me the key code to the room, which was a small studio apartment, sharing a wall with the host's house. There was only one door in and out of the studio. The first red flag was that the key code for the lock on the door was simply 123. I found that odd, but considering the Wi-Fi password, was password. I figured the host was just an older person who wasn't tech savvy. The reviews for the room were pretty good, so I decided to stay. Around 9:30 p.m., things got creepy. I was close to falling asleep when I heard tapping on the window in front of my bed. The window had drapes covering it, so I couldn't see who was making the noise. I responded by saying, "Huh?" loud enough for whoever it was to hear me. A minute or two passed in silence before the tapping started again. I said, "Hello?" pretty loudly, and it went away. I was on edge and immediately messaged the host asking if it was them tapping on the window. An hour later, the host finally responded, saying, "I was going to bring you some water, but it seemed like you were asleep, so I left." I was still very much on edge and knew I wasn't going to be able to sleep. I thought about going for a walk to the store or taking a shower to clear my mind, but something told me to sit tight and wait to see what happened. About 45 minutes went by. It was around midnight by this point, when I heard some noise outside. I then heard the distinct sound of someone trying the key code on my door. The first attempt failed, but I could hear them trying again. This time I heard the sound of the lock disengaging. The door was unlocked. I threw the blankets off of me and ran to the door as it was opening. I slammed it shut in the person's face, yelling, "This is my room. Get out of here. Leave." They responded in a deep voice from the other side of the door, saying, "Maddle said this is my room." Maddle was the name of the host. I kept repeating what I had said before and called the cops, speaking loudly enough so they knew I was on the phone with the police. The police eventually arrived and were not surprised by my story. They said they would hang around until I called an Uber to leave. The host was very combative and unapologetic, and their alibi for who that person was changed multiple times. When the Uber arrived, I jumped in and felt relieved to be getting out of there. It still creeps me out that I never saw the person who was opening my door. I have a feeling it was some kind of setup. If the host knew I was flying in from the East Coast, the 9:30 p.m. tapping on the window would have been equivalent to 12:30 a.m. my time, and the invasion would be around 3 a.m. Maybe it would have just been a robbery, but it could have been much worse. Since then, I have never used Airbnb again. This experience was enough to put me off from ever using it again, preferring the security and professionalism of hotels. I still travel for tournaments, but I make sure my accommodations are safe and well reviewed.